Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to another lecture from the Royal Aeronautical Society Boscombe Down branch. Tonight we'll be hearing from Zaid Meherali, who's going to talk about the art of aviation and defence photography, seeing the unseen, and I'll be introducing him shortly. So I do hope you're all well. As you'll see in a minute, we've got one more lecture to go this season, but we're glad you can join us this evening, and we're glad that we've managed to get past all the IT issues we had with the website. So Zaid has been playing with photography and cameras for over 30 years, with experience of wet film, 15 years of digital photography, and he has an A-level in photography. He's also been a member of the Basic Camera Club for 10 years. He was president for 2013 to 2015 seasons, and he's been a Southern Counties judge for 8 years and has passed critique on club competitions from both within the UK and overseas. In his daytime job, possibly, he works exclusively with the UK Armed Forces as well as other NATO nations to produce stunning images of the military forces at work, and having had his work published and used by the UK MOD, German Luftwaffe and scientific journal Nature. And you can have a look at those on some of his things there in Defence Photos. He's also the Dstl liaison for the Boscombe Down Branch Committee, so we thank him greatly for all of his input to our thing. And as you can probably work out from that, Zaid works at Dstl. So very much great welcome to Zaid, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I hope everything's okay, and I'm going to try and start with an intro. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Defence and Aviation Photography, or Aviation Defence Photography, Seeing the Unseen. I'm not a professional photographer. I would consider myself as a talented amateur whose images have been used in numerous places. What you can see here is a French Air Force Alpha jet and the equipment that the pilots would be wearing, or at least the helmets that the pilots would be wearing. This image was taken at RAF Northolt during one of their famous or infamous night shoots that are organised. And we'll be covering some interesting images that the human eye possibly may not be able to see. It's the ethereal moments, sometimes very long exposures, sometimes very short exposures, where the human eye doesn't actually work as well as you thought it might do. So, seeing the unseen. So who am I? Well, I'd like to have been an aeronautical engineer, and I really wanted to do that, except my mathematics was not particularly great. Was an RAF cadet, so I got to do some flying and some shooting along with a lot of other things. My first proper camera was a Praktica Super TL, which I stole from my father. And then I cut my teeth on an Olympus OM40, which I also stole from my father. I did a City and Guilds in photography, which at that time was wet chemical-based photography. And I then proceeded several years later into buying a Sony digital camera. After finding some of the foibles and shortcomings of that camera, I decided to upgrade and spent a large amount of money with Nikon. And I'm not a member of any of the professional photography societies, and there's an interesting reason why. Most of them don't actually believe in continued professional development, which is, I think, a key part of extending and expanding one's knowledge. So that's kind of an overview of who I am, photography-wise. So who's used my images? Jeff has very kindly done an introduction, and we've had some of my images. This F-16 photo that you saw at the start, it's been used by the Royal Air Force News paper. Royal Navy News has used some of my images as well in articles that I've jointly written with a journalist who was very helpful. Global Aviation Review has used numerous images of mine, including this one of the Luftwaffe Phantom that went out of service. What was it? About 3 years ago now. Dstl has obviously used some of my images. In this case, the corporate plan used 9 of my images in the document. And wonderfully, the B-17 Memorial Flight Sally B have used my image on numerous occasions, which I have effectively given to them. It's my present to them. So they're able to use that license-free and without any issues for publication and for generally for newspapers and things like that where they need the publicity. So, the human eye versus a digital camera. And you might think, well, I don't know here. So, let's have a quick look at the human eye. And I'm not a biologist. However, the diagonal size of the human eye, or if you look at corner to corner like you're looking at a TV screen or a computer monitor, is only 22 millimeters. However, because it's a curved surface, the surface area is about 1,100 millimeters square. The latency or frame rate here is roughly the shortest amount of time it takes for a human eye to register something. So normal video or film is shot at 125th of a second, so you don't detect flicker. However, the human eye can detect transient objects or transient occurrences as short as 1/400th of a second. Human eye sensitivity is about 100 ISO. I've had to convert that from one number to an ISO number so we can actually do a clear comparison. And the resolution is about 120 megapixels. Field of view for the human eye is 135 degrees. However, when you're reading a document like a newspaper or something similar, that actually reduces down to about 6 degrees. So that's the concentration area where you have the most receptors in the back of the eye, and that works only at about an area of about 6 degrees. Whereas the human field of vision, i.e. edge to peripheral edge vision, is about 135. The spatial resolution, i.e. what the human eye can detect, is about an object of 135 millimeters at 1,000 meters. So that's about a kilometer. And that's about 135 millimeters, about a foot in old-fashioned sizes. Human eye's dynamic range is very large. It's between 10 and 14 f-stops. It's not quite figured out. An f-stop is effectively when the brilliance difference between the black and the white is a factor of 1. So 14 f-stops is 14 to the power of 2, I believe, differences between the lightest and the darkest. And then finally, its focal length is fixed at about 22 millimeters. If you look at a professional high quality or high resolution digital camera, like a Nikon D850 DSLR, this is currently with the camera that I currently shoot with. It has a sensor size of approximately about 41 millimeters in the diagonal, but a surface area significantly smaller than the human eye. The latency or frame rate is between 30 seconds and 1/8,000th of a second, with up to 9 frames in that second. So it can shoot 9 images a second at up to 1/8,000th of a second. Sensitivity is extremely high, but interestingly, the resolution is significantly lower than the human eye. So when you're looking at the whole idea of whether you can tell an image is photo quality or not, this is when your human eye actually works significantly better. The field of vision is variable depending on the lens that you're using, and is between 114 degrees and 3 degrees dependent. And again, that is affected by the spatial resolution. Currently in the Nikon camera range, or the Nikon range of lenses, it's between a 14mm and an 800mm are available in either zooms or stepwise lenses. And the dynamic range is literally fixed at 9 f-stops. So that means there's 9 to the 2 difference in brightness, I think. Not exactly sure how that works, but effectively it gives you an idea that the human eye is significantly better in some places than the camera. However, in other areas, the camera can actually outperform the human eye. So, since we are at the Boscombe Down branch, this is another photo. This is a 30-second exposure of the ETPS Augusta Westland 109 helicopter that is used for test and evaluation. And this is in its old colour scheme, I believe. This aircraft, again, with RF Northolt. And here you can see where the contrast issue is. The very bright, strong white of the airframe against the very dark sky. The human eye would ought to be able to you'd see that and the human eye would be able to instantly correct for that. The camera, you have to actually consider doing a long exposure of 30 seconds or more to actually get that contrast and get the light into the camera and onto the sensor itself to be able to expose such an image. So why aviation and defence photography? I've been interested in aviation and defence since I was a child, photography since I was about 10 years old. It's not a normal club subject, and in this case there are very few aviation and defence photographers actually in club photography, and you see a lot of photography, and a lot of the photographers who specialise in this are working for the military or working in defence. So there are Army, Navy or Air Force photographers. There are very few freelancers in the area. So we're going to have a look at some images, and they are the ones that I like and the ones that aren't based on judges or comments, judging scores or comments. So 3 F-16s, 1 Dutch, 2 Belgian. F-16 taken at Leeuwarden Air Force Base in Holland during an exercise, NATO exercise Frisian Flag. This image was taken about 4 years ago, and And interestingly, the thing that you can see here that you don't see with the human eye is in the intake lip of the F-16. What you can see here, and I'll zoom it in for you, is the actual low pressure zone generated by the turbine creating a micro vortex that leads from the leading edge of the lip of the intake all the way down to virtually ground level. And it's interesting that this occurs. This is a micro vortex generated due to the low pressure by the engine being spooled up. So as the engine spools up for the aircraft to taxi and taxi onto the runway, you get this phenomena. It's fleeting and it's only visible for a very short period of time. But as you can see, the vortex runs almost and is visible almost to the ground level. For this reason, obviously, F-16s are highly able to pick up foreign objects and debris from runways, and are very vulnerable to this. I have a second shot here that might show that equally clearly. So I don't know if that one, this is the Belgian F-16 as it taxied out, but this one showed exactly the same phenomena. What you can see in the inlet on the aircraft is actually a structural spar or a structural member to stop the intake from deflecting and from deforming. So that's that dark piece just on the inside, just inside the lip of the intake. And it's interesting that F-16s do this, and you can see it quite clearly when the aircraft powers the engine up to actually move forward. We'll stay with the F-16. Here you can see the Dutch display aircraft taken at RAF Yeovilton. So this is a slow pass. However, what you can see coming off the edge of the end of the wings are what's known as smoke winders. They are a device used to increase the visibility of the aircraft during displays and during maneuvers for the crowd. Interesting here, you can actually see the wake of the wingtip vortices coming off the aircraft and how the smoke defines them and shows them quite clearly. And the toothed edges of the vortices being formed and actually forming all the way around and curling back into the airflow or into the back of behind the aircraft. Obviously, these show the high and the low pressure zones as they join together at the edge of the wingtip. This can be really clearly seen here, and it's only due to the fact that you have smoke showing this, you can actually see these invisible vortices form at the tips of the wings. We'll move to the Royal Air Force Typhoon, and this is a two-seater from RAF Lucas, I believe. This was taken at RAF Waddington. You can see here the low pressure forming condensation over the wingtips or over the wings themselves. As the aircraft pulls very dramatically into the sky at very high angles of attack, condensate naturally forms over the wings and other parts of the fuselage of the aircraft. And here you can see that dramatically shown as the aircraft climbs quite hard into the sky, into altitude. The reason this is occurring is obviously the very large difference between the high pressure and the low pressure zones above the wing. Low pressure above the wing generating lift also causes water vapor to condense out. Interestingly, with this image is the fact that you have one of the engines in reheat while the other is not. This is partially due to the electronic engine controls on the aircraft, where the pilot actually demands a certain amount of power, and the aircraft, I believe, or the computers on the aircraft then demand power from those engines. In this case, for whatever reason, the aircraft or the computers on the aircraft have not decided to engage the other afterburner or reheat. It's quite interesting, and it catches something that you wouldn't be able to see, because when the aircraft is at over a kilometre's distance away, it's a spec, whereas with an 800mm lens, you have the ability to get very close and very tight into that aircraft and see these phenomena, which are not normally visible. And again, wingtip vortices and a leading edge vortice and condensate on the Dutch F-16 for a second time. The aircraft climbs quite dramatically, and during high G and highly dynamic maneuvers, the leading edge extensions on the aircraft generate their own vortices, and as such these are significantly lower pressure than the rest of the air flowing over the wing. As that air is twisted and aerodynamically manipulated by the wing and the leading edge extensions, you see these kind of transient effects, especially in high humidity or high humidity or high temperature, when there's a lot of water vapor in the air, and it just effectively the low pressure causes it to condense out. As you can also see, the leading edge the wingtip vortices here are a very different shape from the ones that the aircraft was generating previously on the flat approach, and are significantly more disturbed, and they're not as smooth and as slick as the other setup. From the F-16 we can move to the Dstl Rafale, and this image was taken at RAF Yeovilton again. And this is the French Navy Rafale, the M edition. And again here you can see, as the aircraft is turning extremely hard, you can see a full layer of condensate forming on the upper surface of the wing. And this is very transient. This lasts for tenths or seconds or tenths of seconds as the aircraft pulls across the sky in a highly dynamic maneuver. The issue here, or the photography issue and the capture issue here, is the military aircraft are relatively small and are moving at quite high speed and are highly maneuverable. Therefore, capturing the image is quite difficult and requires a certain amount of skill when panning and also shutter technique. Again, Dstl Rafale from the French Air Force. This is the standard edition, not the maritime edition. Climbing very hard into the skies above the Belgian air show at the Sannicol International Air Show. So Sannicol International Air Show is an interesting air show, since it's Europe's only evening air show that has a day on Friday evening when they hold a sunset air show. The air show itself is broken into three pieces. There's the Friday evening air show, a Saturday practice day, and then a Sunday air show that's open to the public. So the evening air show on the Friday, the aircraft participate, and they start quite early. They start quite early in the evening, and they run right into nightfall. And this is where you get to see some of the most interesting images. Because you've got the cooling air and the condensation is starting to build in the air, or it's starting to cool. So there's quite a lot of humidity. And as the aircraft start to maneuver towards the end of their display or towards the end of the display line, they naturally have to maneuver quite aggressively. This results in significant amounts of condensation and condensate forming above the wings. And in this case, you can see the canard platform generating its own set of vortices and a very small condensate above the cockpit. So I can do a zoom here into that image. And here you can clearly see the airflow over the wing from the leading edge and from the wingtips, and also interestingly from the canards themselves. All four sets of planes are generating their own sets of vortices which are interacting with each other. You can also additionally see a rippled condensate area directly above the canopy of the aircraft. Now this image is shot at 1/4000th of a second. It was taken with a 400mm zoom lens, so has been taken. The aircraft is over 1 kilometre away. It's at about 1,000 meters away, and you're able to quite clearly see the condensate patterns on the airframe that are being generated by the aircraft. You can clearly see they're not shock waves as such, they are the patterns of airflow and how the air is being manipulated into low pressure zones over the wing. And as the air trails out and over the trailing edge as well, you can see some minor or some condensate occurrences there as well. The Belgian F-16 here, obviously launching flares or infrared countermeasures that are normally used to protect the aircraft and the airframe and the pilot against heat-seeking weapons or heat-seeking missiles. The flares in this case are used as part of the display and as a pyrotechnic flourish. The display is quite dynamic and again is at the Sannicolde International Air Show, so it's now coming towards the evening. You can see the smoke winders on the ends of the wingtips. The aircraft is in full reheat, and this is clearly seeable. Interestingly, the only light from the image here that is the only light source for the image here is actually the light from those flares or those pyrotechnics that are being launched off the aircraft. And this is very transient. This is very short-lived. The aircraft launches these and there is a heartbeat between launch, lighting, and the flares disappearing and the aircraft disappearing in the other direction or moving out of the frame. The difficulty in the image is the extreme contrast between the brightness and the darkness. The flares are burning at over 2,500 degrees, being thermite Viton and aluminium, or aluminium burning with Viton. So that's the reason why these are so bright. Interestingly, you can actually see the individual sparks coming off the pyrotechnics and the cluster that they're launched in. The aircraft itself is obviously banking heavily away from that direction, and you can kind of tell, or you can kind of see the clustered launch that they come out in. So they launched in pairs or threes off the airframe by a flare launcher, which is, I believe, tucked in the rear of the aircraft. Yeah, it's an interesting image. I like it. It's got great dynamic feel to it, and a great pose of the aircraft. Other transient effects. So we're looking here at a Royal Air Force Tornado GR4, which is now sadly out of service. Tornado was a great aircraft, and this aircraft, this photo was taken at the Royal Naval Air Station, Yeovilton. What you can see here is literally the rubber burning and squeaking off the main landing gear as the aircraft lands. And the fact that this image was taken at 1/8000th of a second is testament to the speed and the impact that landing wheels undertake as they touch the concrete or the runway surface. You can see the dynamics and again the airflow of the tire as it touches the runway, and how long that smoke or that friction is generated, that is effectively rubbing the rubber off the tire and turning it into smoke. This is prior to the thrust reversers coming online and decelerating the aircraft. The nose wheel is still up, and fractions of maybe about half a meter off the actual contact with the runway. The thing is, when things happen in such short time frames, the human eye just doesn't acknowledge it. We see the smoke plume at the end. What we don't see is the contact point and the friction that's generated and the results of that friction. It's quite interesting that this, you can't imagine how much force or how much energy occurs during landing, and it's only when you get a chance to see the amount of smoke and the amount of fumes generated as the main wheels touch, you get to see the amount of damage that occurs to the tires as that friction occurs from a tire being at stationary and at 0 speed to 130 miles an hour plus landing speed in fractions of a second. The British Army have a number of Apache attack helicopters. This pair was taken on Salisbury Plain during a pre-deployment exercise to Afghanistan, exercise Pashtun Jaguar. The aircraft, or the helicopters in this case, have just been refueled and are refueled with the engines running. So what's known as what is known as the forward arming and refueling point. You can see this in the background with the second aircraft. It is still being fueled and is just about to be disconnected, or has been disconnected, and is just waiting for clearance to depart. The interesting capture here is not the aircraft themselves, but you can clearly see the engine efflux and heat generated from the engines being blown down past the airframe itself and out of and being able to be visualized by the blurring that's behind the aircraft itself. You can actually see how on the aircraft at the back the rotor blades go from very sharp and very crisp to beautifully blurred and soft. And this is due to the heat and the density differences in the air because of that temperature difference. The engine exhaust is extremely high temperature, even though it's had been cooled by the black hole infrared suppression system that the aircraft is fitted with, that the helicopters are fitted with. That hot exhaust is being mixed with the rotor blade downdraft. The still hot exhaust is causing the ripples, the two areas of blurring that you can see directly behind that aircraft that's hovering. And it quite clearly shows how wide and where that pattern of distribution is for that airflow. You can clearly see directly underneath the aircraft, it's still crisp, and you can see the background trees quite clearly and quite crisply. However, you can also see as the aircraft to either side of that are the areas that are blurred, that contrast where that hot air is being taken to or being blown down, due to both the lift generated by the rotor blades, but also the direction of the infrared suppression system that's fitted to the aircraft. You can also clearly see in the aircraft behind how that hot gas is less diffused and is more being pushed backwards due to the lack of downdraft from that helicopter's set of rotor blades. And it's the fact that the human eye would not detect this blurring. It's because the human eye would see ripples, but not. It's the fact that this exposure is a long exposure. It's in the order of about 1/100th of a second. So where the human eye would detect the actual ripples of the deformation and the density difference in the air, the camera, because it's a longer exposure, detects a blurring or shows a blurring in that area. So it actually it shows that area more clearly and is more defined because of the longer exposure length that it is using, if that makes any sense. We'll stay with the Apache attack helicopter for a moment, and again, this is a British Army one. Here you can see this is during the British Army live firepower demonstration, and the aircraft is firing live 30mm ammunition. The muzzle blast has been captured, the muzzle flash, should I say, has been captured in an instant. This is taken again at approximately this is about 1/1000th of a second. And it's only when you can slow time down to those kind of moments and hold them for longer than they actually are, you manage to see the detail here. You can clearly see the muzzle flash from the Apache's cannon. You can clearly see the empty rounds or the empty cases from that gun falling beneath the gun, and you can clearly see how the muzzle flash is actually reflected in the muzzle itself. And we'll stay with the Apache for one more moment. This, again, taken at the Sannikol International Air Show. This is the Dutch version of the Apache. So it is missing the longbow radar that is atop the rotor mast. And here you can clearly see three things that you would not be able to see. Firstly, the transient nature, the very high speed of this. This is taken at 1/500th of a second. You can clearly see here the condensation vapor trails from the tips of the rotors. These are the lines running around the rotor edge that are highlighted, these light curved lines on the edge of the rotor disc. Secondly, you can clearly see the flares. The helicopter has launched, again as an infrared countermeasure. And interestingly, you can see clearly how the smoke from those flares is being sucked into the rear rotor of the aircraft, the tail rotor of the helicopter. This is a very short-lived occurrence. You would not be able to see maybe 3 of these things simultaneously. The human eye would detect the flares going off, and you would see the brightness and the contrast. You would not see the helicopter. You would know it was there, but the human eye would not detect the helicopter due to the difference in the brightness and the darkness. The contrast between those two, the human eye would not be able to actually detect. The brightness would be too bright, the helicopter was too dark, and the human eye would not be able to detect both at the same time. You see all of this because the camera's CMOS, the camera's sensor is capturing the light and recording it. And then in post-production, there is a certain amount that can be done to assist that visualization. You can bring things out, you can make things more obvious by playing with the levels and playing with the actual image in post-production. So from one very bright thing to another very bright thing. And again, very transitory. This was taken at 1/4000th of a second. So this is 1/4000th of a second captured for eternity, or captured for a very long time, so that you can all, so that everybody can see, or so that you can actually see what is happening. This is the British Army Challenger 2 main battle tank firing its 120mm main gun. What you can see here is the fireball and the shock wave that is generated by the discharge of that weapon. On the right hand side, you can clearly see 2 or 3 objects disappearing out of the frame. This particular object here, these particular objects here are part of the firing system. They are not the shell itself. They are not the projectile. What you can see is parts of the loading system, or parts of the projectile that are used to steady the projectile down down the barrel. And as you can clearly see on this piece just here, you can actually see the twist, and it's spinning through the air. What the projectile itself is actually somewhere in that fireball. You can clearly see also the shock wave and how the ground is behaving and reflecting, and that shock wave and that fireball that's generating. That's being generated on the discharge of this weapon, or the firing of this weapon. The target is actually 2,200 meters away, that little wisp of smoke right at the top of the frame. This image was captured at a British Army firepower demonstration, and was captured as a part of one of 9 images captured in that second. Interestingly, the other images either side of this do not actually show the fireball. The muzzle flash is approximately, somebody in the British Army said the fireball only lasts for 1/200th of a second. So capturing this is quite a tricky thing. When there's it's not down to skill, it's down to luck. we will go to ZH900, one of the infamous 8 Chinooks that were purchased by the Royal Air Force during Optelic and Opheric. Here shown at RAF Northolt, just after delivery. So this is actually this aircraft was brought to RAF Northolt for a night shoot by the Chinook evaluation team. So they were doing the workup on the aircraft. What you can clearly see here is, firstly, again, that softening effect from the engine exhaust or the hot efflux. You can see the fact that everything on the nose side of the aircraft, the background on the nose is crisp and clear, but on the behind the aircraft it's actually soft and blurred, and this is partially due, or this is entirely due to that hot gas generated by the engines and the that rippling of the air that you see, that heat haze. And this is that, except it's a 30-second exposure. It's about a 25-second to 30-second exposure. So you're seeing things here that you wouldn't inherently see. Additionally, you can actually see the anti-collision beacon highlighting lights, or the rotor, the rotors of the Chinook actually reflecting the anti-collision beacon. This is shown by a series of very light light-coloured spots that are across the frame. These are the lights reflecting off the aircraft, or the lights of the aircraft reflecting off the rotor blades or the rotor tips. And you can see that as a series of spots. You would not see that, the human eye wouldn't detect that. That's undetectable to the human eye. Because it's a long exposure, because the light is being stacked inside the camera sensor, you're getting this effect. So you're getting the additional, you're getting you're getting an amount of light coming into the sensor, and then because the shutter is left open, you're getting more light coming in. So you're getting an addition effect. So the light is being, any lights being shown are being enhanced. So this isn't how the actual image was captured. So I will show you what effectively is the digital negative of that frame. So that's the digital negative. It's softer, it's not as crisp, it shows lower contrast, it shows a lot of things that have been cleaned up in the image. You can see here another aircraft taxiing, some very bright lights. You can see a few things here. You can see a very bright light here. If I go back a frame, you can see how very gently in post-production some of those have been removed, or de-highlighted would be a good term to use, in order to enhance the image. And I use the word enhance. It is true to the image that I wanted to take. It just had some distracting elements within it. And with that, I will almost close with the last image. This is one of my favorite images. It's an image that was taken in Germany at the retirement of this aircraft, and it is one of the most important aircraft for Western aviation. The McDonnell Douglas F4 Phantom II, this being the German version, being an F version. And you go, well, that looks a really nice black and white image. Firstly, cameras don't take black and white images normally. Black and white is a creation. The human eye sees in colour. It very rarely sees in black and white. So you see the black and white, the monochrome of the image. Additionally, the highlights and the shadows have been made larger or brought closer. So the clouds have been enhanced. They've been made to look more powerful, more aggressive, more contrasty. The darks inside the hardened aircraft shelter have been brought out. The shadow detail has just been set so that there is an even amount of dark blacks in the image and bright whites in the image. So the overall image has been manipulated. However, it has been manipulated in a way that is not obvious and that enhances the image. And this is one of the interesting things. Photography allows you to take an image and manipulate it after you've seen it, and allows you to pull more detail out than you would have seen with the eye. So it gives you a more true to life image than the camera would see, and it's more like the human eye image, but it still retains some of those details that you would not have seen otherwise. And I think that's one of the things that I find fascinating about photography and aviation, because you see these very transient, very short-lived things really clearly, or you see detail that you would not have seen otherwise by enhancing the image to the point where it shouldn't look manipulated or faked. And with that, thank you very much. I do hope you found this lecture entertaining, or at least interesting, and some of those images were of interest to you.
Zaid, that was great. Really interesting stuff. I mean, kind of makes I remember finding some fairly grubby black and white pictures taken in Instamatic at Farnborough Air Show back in the 1970s as being rather very basic. We have a few questions. I'm just going to kick off with one, which is, have you done any wet film stuff recently? And if you have, what have you done the aviation wet film stuff, and what would you get from that?
Wet film. So wet film is amazing. I love wet film. It is a game of patience. You sit, you take the photograph, you process the negatives, you then have to go into a darkroom and you print. And it's only at that point you know what you have. And it's a thing of patience. You have to be a very patient man to do wet film photography. I did wet film aviation photography a long time ago, and in some way I find it really enjoying, because you have to wait, and it removes the instant gratification from digital. Digital is a bit like going to a McDonald's and having a Big Mac. It's there, it's done, it's instant, and you can eat it and enjoy it there and then. Wet film photography is closer to cooking a stew. It takes time. You need to cut the ingredients up. Everything has to go into the pot. You then have to cook it for several hours, and only then, when you finally taste it, you know you've got it right. And the problem is, a lot a lot of places that want to use my images, a lot of organizations that have used my images want the images now. They want them there and then. Royal Air Force News, when they used that image of the F-16 and the Typhoon, I shot that on a Saturday. They wanted on the Friday, they wanted the images and the text to go with them Saturday morning. So in this current time where news stories come and go and the image is everything, I think wet film has been forgotten as an art form when it comes to aviation photography. And I would do it for static subjects like the F4 Phantom shot that you saw right at the end, the black and white. But it's carrying around cameras, film, and processing gear. You just have to shoot what you've got and you have to pray. Whereas with digital, at least you know you've got something, and you have that instant gratification to know you've got something in the pot or something in the bag, so you can go away at least with a sense of, okay, it might not be perfect, but I've got something that I can then manipulate in post-production on a laptop. Does that kind of answer the question,
Yeah,
Jeff?
no, that's fantastic. I think we should go to some of the ones that we have been put up here. There are some that hopefully Jack's going to publish in a sec, so I'm going to start with the ones that from the top here. Just a comment from Phil, who just says that the resolution of the human eye, only the central vision is 2020, and at 20 degrees off the center, it drops to just 10%. Which is an interesting point. That means that a single glance only yields about 5 to 15 megapixels. So that's an interesting one, depending on your eyes.
And that's the interesting thing.
Yeah. Then there are a few comments about the flares picture. Richard Lord says, would the flares not be astern of the aircraft? Tim Gosling very helpfully says the flares are magnesium Teflon, and he thinks a fantastic composition on shot. They're either directly out from the skin or slightly below forward. They then fall away and behind, he says. They've been fired downward from the airframe in high G over the vertical maneuver. Amazing stuff. A question though from Bill Tyack is, when shooting dynamic images, do you always take multiple shots?
Yes. When shooting dynamically, I have the camera is set to as fast a frame rate as I can get, basically. So it'll be about somewhere between 9 and 9.5 frames per second. The autofocus is set for auto, so I let the autofocus do as much work as I can do. So I can concentrate on the shutter speed that I want to aim for and the composition. And that's really quite critical. Composing the image and making sure it's sharp is 9/10. And if I can if I can get the camera to deal with some of that, then I will gladly let the camera deal with some of that. I can then concentrate on actually getting the image that I'm looking for and trying to get the right kind of shutter speed. So it's dealing with the aperture and it's dealing with the autofocus.
Okay, there's a comment from Richard Lord about the comparison of the eye versus camera. He says, wide detail sensitive defence areas better as a commercial aircraft and birds and birds. But I guess the point is anybody could take the pictures of the defence subjects and draw their conclusions, I guess. But moving on, though, there's some questions here which I'm going to try and bring together, just two of them. Bill Strandberg asked, do you use a floating ISO setting to capture fast jet flybys? And what shutter setting do you use to keep the propeller motion from standing still?
So that's quite interesting. So for fast jets, effectively everything that isn't a helicopter or has propellers on it, I try and aim for as fast as I can get. So that's about at least 1,000 to a thousandth of a second to 1/8,000th of a second. So it's normally that real top end, that real high end speed parts of where the camera shutter works in is normally is where I normally use it. If it's a helicopter or it's a a propeller-driven aircraft, it will be about 125th to 200th of a second to get that motion and that blur in the rotor head or in the propeller. And I don't use a floating ISO. I set the camera at ISO 100, or the lowest ISO setting the camera can, the lowest ISO setting the camera will operate in natively, i.e. I think it's about 100, but the Nikon, some of the Nikons will actually have a low 1, a low 2 and a low 3 below that 100 rating, or some of the Canons also will go below that, right, below below the numbers of ISO. So I'll set it at basically the lowest ISO number I can get and just leave it, and then use shutter and aperture as my two controllers to adjust the speed, if that makes any sense.
No, that's great. Question from Phil: do you favour long fixed length telephotos for your air shows or a zoom lens?
So I have a 400 f2.8, which is a monstrous piece of glass that's about, well, it's about 7.5 kilos in weight, which is my go-to airshow lens. But I will have a second body with a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 attached to it for things like the Red Arrows or a display team or a big aircraft like a B-52 or something similar, or a C-130, or those larger cargo type aircraft need a shorter lens, whereas small fighters, helicopters, Spitfires, those type of military aircraft, the small civilian two-seater aircraft, they all need a 400mm lens, and that's my go-to lens. It's a cracking piece of glass. It's really sharp, really contrasty, but one has got a price tag to go with it, but it also requires a monopod for it to be sat on a monopod, just so that you're not carrying it around and not hoiking it around and trying to manipulate it or maneuver it.
Okay. And then another question here from Emily Gissing. It says, how do you judge what to take? I guess is probably the thing, and she's supposed to sort of question mark afterwards. Is that based because you think you'll get a good image once it's enhanced? So
my thoughts. So there are two different groups of aviation photographers. A majority of aviation photographers want to capture every aircraft of its type. So in other words, they will go serial number hunting and try and get every C-130 Hercules model J or model K, and they will want a photograph of each one showing the serial number, and once they've got it, they're quite happy. There's another group of aviation photographers which I kind of join with, or I kind of associate with, and I want to get archetypal images of the type. So that means the C-130 photo, I want it to be turning, running, with the cargo door, with the back cargo door open, and people loading things into it. Or at night, I want the shot of, the back of the aircraft, so you can't actually see a huge amount of detail, but the back door open and the cargo being loaded in and people maneuvering things in. So those are the kind of images that I'm after. So if I get a really good Apache image, like the one with the flares that you saw earlier, that's it. I'm quite happy with that as my Apache flare image. I won't go hunting for that image again. I will not bother shooting that image again. Even if it appears at an air show, it's done. I've got it. I've kind of ticked it off as in, that's a great Apache image. I'm not going to do any better. Checkbox checked. In the same with the F-16 image, as it's pulling up with the flares. That's a great image. It's crisp. It's tidy, it's dynamic. That's it. I will not shoot the Belgian F-16 doing its flare display again. That's it. So if that, Emily, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Okay, and then the last one here is from Bill again. Bill Strandberg, do you capture only RAW, JPEG, or both? And do you prefer only one when shooting at high frame rates?
So I can tell there's several photographers actually here from the questions. I actually shoot just a raw image. So I shoot the raw image as it comes out of the camera. And that's the only thing I shoot. I don't bother shooting JPEG. I don't bother shooting TIFFs or anything else. It's just the raw JPEG. It's just the raw file that I use.
Thank you very much for a fantastic lecture, Zaid. I think everyone's enjoyed it. There was various messages of thanks and interest on it, so it's been really good, and hope everyone's inspired when things get a bit better to go out and take some pictures, whether they be of aircraft or other things. But it's been really inspirational, so thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again on the 13th of April for Sir Brian Burridge. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye.